Good evening and welcome to Behind the Headlines. Today is Wednesday the 2nd of February 2022, and in this programme today we will be discussing the biggest foreign policy challenge facing the West and Europe, certainly in decades, as President Putin's Russian forces amass on Ukraine's border, with it believed to be between 100,000 and 130,000 troops, including field hospitals, tanks and weapons poised to invade Ukraine. And of course we've seen the diplomatic moverings of President Biden, who has announced that he's sending 3,000 troops, American troops, to the Ukraine. We've seen that our own Prime Minister, despite all his political woes and troubles, has flown out to Ukraine to show support and solidarity. And as we do in this programme, there's news that the RAF Typhoon fighters had to intercept 4 Russian Bear bomber planes off the coast of Scotland that were very, very close to British airspace. As we can see that the tension is mounting as we discuss the crisis in Ukraine. Regan, it's good to see you and great that we can discuss this programme. I think this is the 3rd time we've discussed the situation in the Ukraine, the last time being last April. But since then we see the situation becoming more and more precarious and more difficult as we see that Putin is essentially outplaying the West and driving a wedge between European NATO members and also the States.
I think we talked just before New Year perhaps about asking the question, could this lead to World War III? And that's definitely, I mean, we're seeing the nations of the world getting involved, at least in word. We've seen, as you said, Boris Johnson travel to Kiev. He was there today. And I think it's important that these leaders show their solidarity and show that they will back Ukraine and that they, at least verbally, are going to be supportive. And I do hope that they will put more than word into it if push comes to shove. Perhaps the support that Ukraine is receiving now, which is completely different from what we've seen in, let's say, when the conflict first began in 2014, will cause Putin to take a step back and say, is this the right time? It might not stop an invasion of Ukraine, but it could certainly delay it and push it off for another year.
Absolutely. So just a reminder, we are live, we are interactive tonight, and without your emails and without your text messages, then we don't really have a programme. We really appreciate your interaction. So the question that we're posing in tonight's programme is the following: why should we defend Ukraine from a Russian invasion? So I'd love to know your views and your opinions. So we'll just have to wait for the iPad. Also want to go down here that really what we're seeing here is, I mean, it's incredible. I don't think we've seen this in Europe for decades. The fact that Russia has deployed over 100,000, between 100,000 and 130,000 troops on Ukraine's border. We also see that Putin has also deployed 30,000 troops in Belarus and currently undertaking war games, and that is making the Poles and also the Baltic states extremely nervous, and which means that NATO's having to watch very carefully what Putin is doing, and he's certainly flexing his muscles. But what's also interesting, this is all tied in with the natural gas that Putin's been supplying to Europe, and apparently, according to the research I've done today, that he's reduced the supply of natural gas to Europe by 47%. And this is why countries like Germany and Italy and France are not pushing for stronger military action to confront him. I suppose the big danger is that I don't think what we're going to see now is a full-scale invasion of the Ukraine, because it would need about 230,000 troops in order to do that, but certainly could take large swathes of territory in the Ukraine.
Well, let's not forget the scale of the Russian military compared to Ukraine's. Okay, Russia has 1 million soldiers at its disposal. Ukraine has 250,000. it swamps. There's no comparison. Consider 13,000 tanks versus 2,430 tanks. Russia with the 13,000, Ukraine with the 2,430. Russia has 285 pieces of aircraft. How many does Ukraine have? Well, it has 285 as well. So we could say, oh, that's great. Okay, there's some equality when it comes to aircraft, but 603 warships as opposed to 25 warships. 6,400 nuclear weapons. Simon, how many nuclear weapons does Ukraine have?
Zero. Because they had to give them up in order to guarantee their Western security back in the 90s under Bill Clinton. As part of that agreement, that the America and the United States and Britain would come to the defense of the Ukraine, provided that they actually gave up their nuclear weapons. Because the policy was then to stop the kind of proliferation of nuclear weapons throughout the fallen Soviet Union, so they wouldn't fall into the hands of kind of rogue regimes. In order to do that, the Ukraine gave up their nuclear weapons. And it's a bit of an irony, really, isn't it, that had Ukraine kept their nuclear weapons, Russia wouldn't be amassing 100,000 troops on their borders today. And I think that's also significant. But also, I think what's also significant as well is that the Ukraine has undergone a cultural revolution over the past decade. Before they were very much influenced in the Russian sphere, but now Ukraine is asserting its own identity. Ukraine is its own language, and therefore they no longer want to be dominated and subjected by Putin. And so this plays a major role in the way that young Ukrainians are thinking. They're more geared to the West. And the big question is that Ukraine should have the choice. The Ukrainian people, the Ukrainian government, whether they actually want to be part of influence under the West, be a member of the EU, to be part of NATO, or to be on Russia's sphere of influence. And this is what I think Putin's fearing.
Well, Putin definitely wants Ukraine to view themselves as a sort of younger brother to Russia, maybe even more than that. I personally think that Putin would love it if the Ukrainians just threw up hands and said, hey, it's fine, be our Lord and Master. I'm confident that he would be thrilled with that sort of scenario. If we can look at some of the stuff that he's written previously, in July last year, Putin published a 5,000-word article on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians, in which he wrote that he was convinced that the true sovereignty of Ukraine is possible only in partnership with Russia. He vowed Moscow would never allow the country to become anti-Russia. And so what you've touched on right there, the real attraction of Ukraine to join NATO, the request, the attraction to the West, is causing Putin to think, okay, I'm losing my grip over this. We're losing grip. We're losing influence. Russia has historically, when people think of vast swathes of Eastern Europe, they don't necessarily immediately bring to mind the individual nations. They often still think USSR, or they think Soviet, or they think Russia, because of Russia's power even over the sovereign states that came out of that old USSR. So with Ukraine saying, actually, we want to join NATO, we want to align ourselves more under the influence of various Western nations and be a big part of that, Putin is leaning back, thinking, okay, we're losing our significance and power, and is perhaps feeling a bit isolated.
I mean, if we take this from a kind of Russian perspective, and we have to play that history plays a major part doubt in our understanding of what Putin is effectively doing. There's no doubt that he's an authoritarian dictator, that's for sure. But the reality is that that Putin feels very threatened by the fact that Ukraine is the biggest country in Europe. It's the size of Britain and Germany combined, and he sees Ukraine as being a buffer zone against NATO and the West. And therefore, if he feels like he loses the Ukraine, that means it pushes NATO forces even closer to Russia. And we've got to understand that in the thoughts of the Russians, firstly was the invasion by Napoleon, I think in 1812. That would be the first lesson from history that the Russians would be learning. And then, of course, the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, and saying that we never ever want to allow that to happen again. So a big part of this is in his thinking, but also his kind of grandeur. I mean, he's a former head of the KGB. He said that the worst thing that's ever happened to Russia was losing the Soviet republics with the collapse of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and then the Soviet Union in 91. So therefore he wants to rebuild a new Russian federation that will dominate the West, and ideologically he still probably believes that Russia's ultimate game is to bring the United States down as a world superpower.
I've seen some fairly bizarre takes on the Russia-Ukraine conflict, Simon, and some of these I think are just rooted in ignorance. People looking at Ukraine as a small, insignificant state, right, that in some way lacks its own ability to govern and lacks the right to national sovereignty. But Ukraine is the largest country in Europe. It's greater than Britain and Germany combined. In its size. It's massive, and so it's incredible strategic importance for Putin. We can see he's ramping up the fear factor. There's psychological, mental war games going on, even as he has 30,000 troops in Belarus, practicing maneuvers, essentially giving off all signals that they are going to be invading Ukraine at some point. Now, there's the speculation that we're seeing increasingly of a military D-Day style maneuver in which President Putin sends troops onto the beaches of the Black Sea. Doubtless, 603 warships. You suddenly offload loads of warships into the Black Sea, and you have troops. You're going to just overwhelm all of the ports that they arrive at. The idea would be that they capture the port of Odessa, and then there would be a blitzkrieg style lightning strike against the capital, Kiev, or potentially a two-pronged pincer move with Russian tanks attacking from Western Russia and the Crimea to annihilate Ukraine forces east of the Dnieper River. Now, Simon, we've talked a little bit before about the latter option, which has to, I believe, be done before March because of the climate at the time.
Absolutely, and I think this is so significant because when you become a student of history, you look back at major conflicts and they're all determined pretty much by the weather. So it looked like Putin was going to invade around the 11th of January this year. But because of the exceptionally warm winter that the Ukrainians were having, he couldn't launch a full-scale invasion because his tanks wouldn't be able to cross the marshes. So he needs the marshes to freeze over with the ice. And then the snow, so in order to get the Russian tanks over. So he has a limited time frame if he wants to launch an invasion till the end of March when the snow thaws, and that would just be impossible. So he waits on another year. So again, we're seeing the influence of weather intervening in human history, and you can only say that that's God because history is his story after all. Have we got any emails?
Reminder, we are live and interactive this evening. Please send your thoughts in regarding why we should defend Ukraine against an invasion by Russia. We do already have some texts and emails. We see Jay says the UK is led by an amateur comedian. Incredibly, the Ukraine's leader is a professional comedian. Are Biden and Johnson hyping this up to distract from their own woeful positions at home? It's an interesting question. It's a question that I ask in an upcoming interview that we'll be looking at. Is it possible that there's, in some way, ourselves in the West drawing Russia into a conflict to cause the public become populist?
Well, I think we have to just kind of look at the kind of facts on the ground, really, Regan, and realise that there are 100,000 troops on the borders of a sovereign nation state, which means that it's Putin that is doing the provoking. It's Putin that's showing aggression here in this kind of reaction. But I mean, the danger is, and this is what we've got to learn the lessons from history. And when we look at the kind of 1930s, the policy of appeasement by European leaders allowed the Germans then, through Hitler, to rearm, take the Sudetenland, take the Czechoslovakia, and then launch a full-scale invasion of Poland on the 2nd of September 1939. And the great danger is that that could be done again. I mean, all it needs is for Putin to have a foothold in the Ukraine. If he then takes control, puts a puppet as a president, a Russian puppet in power in Ukraine, he has control of the Ukraine. Build up more and more troops like he is in Belarus and previously in Kyrgyzstan, and then threaten the Baltic states, then threaten Poland. And then we're dealing with then we know that the Russian bear will be right on Europe's borders. And it's interesting to note how our European allies are responding to this. And there's a great quote by the mayor of Kiev, because the German defense minister has said that he's going to be, last week, that he's going to send the Ukrainians 5,000 helmets that will help them push back the 100,000 Russian troops poised to invade.
Amazingly generous.
And I'll give you the glory. I'll let you have the quote because it's a brilliant quote.
Yeah, I mean, 5,000 helmets, for an army of...
I was going to push back Putin's forces.
Oh, amazing, yeah. And I mean, you can look and see, you have 250,000 troops who all probably have a helmet anyway, but that aside, the mayor of Kiev has said 5,000 helmets are a complete joke. What is Germany going to send us next? Support pillows? Are we going to get this for support, pillows? Are we, I mean, look at 5,000 helmets, Simon. That's not going to repel. That's not going, I mean, you can say, okay, well, that's nice. You have 5,000 people, but this is not a makeshift army. Okay, yes, you do have loads of civilians who will be coming in, but Ukraine is able to source a lot of equipment. What it needs is assurance that if push comes to shove, there will be boots on the ground.
Absolutely.
That's what it needs.
I don't think we're going to actually see that because there isn't the political appetite for that.
Well, I mean, this is a question that is being asked in some of the viewer interactions regarding the support from the United States and why Russia is trying to enact what looks to be certainly an upcoming invasion. Is this being done because Biden is incredibly weak? Is this being done because we have weak Western leaders? Someone says that they don't believe this would happen if Trump was president. Perhaps, I'm not certain. I mean, there's mixed signals coming out from the Republican Party as to where it actually stands on this situation. I'm seeing some Republicans in states of prominence suggesting that, yeah, okay, let Russia, it's fine. We should side with Russia in this, which is concerning to me. I'm not 100% certain that it is only to do with Biden's weakness. In fact, honestly, one of the things that frustrates me, speaking as an American, is the way in which the U.S. often centers itself in every big breaking news story in the world. Okay, I get it's had the reputation of being the world's police, and it has, been used by God in many ways. but the United States so often, speaking as an American, makes every story happening globally about itself. And to look at what's going on between Russia and Ukraine and ask whether or not Putin is doing this only because the U.S. has a weak leader makes out that the U.S. is a lot more powerful than it is. Let's not forget Russia and the USA have been enemies for the better part of last century. We were reluctant allies for convenience sake in World War II. There was a Cold War that immediately followed that. I don't know that the Cold War ever really ended. I mean, yes, you see the USSR comes to an end, but our relationship with Russia hasn't exactly been warm and friendly. So I'm not convinced that Putin gives any care for what the United States or any of its presidents thinks of him. I think he is dead set on domination.
That's a great analysis. I think you're right, but it's also a bit of a paradox, as you mentioned there, that the United States, for example, wants to center every major news story around itself, but the reality is that the American people don't actually get very much foreign news.
No. We get nothing.
And so therefore you're not informed, you're not really educated, unlike the exception, which is CBN. So let's have a look now at the latest CBN news report that looks into the crisis occurring in Ukraine.
Jenna, the unusual back and forth started when Russia's ambassador accused the United States of whipping up hysteria regarding Moscow's troop deployments. America's ambassador responded by condemning Russia's use of threats and military escalation to strong-arm the international community.
The discussions about a threat of war is provocative in and of itself. You are almost calling for this. You want it to happen. You're waiting for it to happen, as if you want to make your words become a reality.
America's UN ambassador, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, firing back that the West and Ukraine are not the aggressors here.
This is the largest, hear me clearly, mobilization of troops in Europe in decades. And as we speak, Russia is sending even more forces and arms to join them.
Moscow insists the West wants to weaken Russia by creating tension with Ukraine and the rest of the world.
We do not think that this will help to bring this council together. Rather, we fully understand that the desire of our American colleagues to whip up hysterics regarding its own situations, regarding the so-called Russian act of aggression. This is of great harm, this hysterica, to Ukraine itself.
You've heard from our Russian colleagues that we're calling for this meeting to make you all feel uncomfortable. Imagine how uncomfortable you would be if you had 100,000 troops sitting on your border in the way that these troops are sitting on the border with Ukraine.
Meanwhile, efforts underway in the Senate to pass a massive bipartisan sanctions bill to be used against Russia should it move on Ukraine.
It's to include a variety of elements, massive sanctions against the most significant Russian banks, crippling to their economy, meaningful in terms of consequences to the average Russian and their accounts and pensions, more lethal assistance to Ukraine, the ability to deal with Russia's sovereign debt, to look at sectoral elements of Russia's economy, which is largely an extracting economy on energy, to sanction its sovereign debt.
Statement following today's Security Council meeting, President Biden said the U.S. is prepared for every scenario, writing, quote, "If Russia is sincere about addressing our respective security concerns through dialogue, the United States and our allies and partners will continue to engage in good faith. If instead Russia chooses to walk away from diplomacy and attack Ukraine, Russia will bear the responsibility and will face swift and severe consequences." Jenna?
Well, helpful as always from CBN there. We have some emails and text to read out. This is from Anita. Good evening, Simon and Regan. Always lovely to see you both. I heard on the news yesterday that the Russians may even attack via the Black Sea too, which we were just talking about that. It's certainly getting very serious. Boris Johnson said yesterday that Russia needs to step back. He declared that the UK stands shoulder to shoulder with Kiev. So if war does happen, and it looks extremely likely, we may well find ourselves in a difficult predicament. The trouble is, if we don't intervene, then Putin could well see it as a red light, or we'll say a green light, to continue invading other countries. It is reminiscent of Hitler and World War II. I am praying for God to intervene. The scripture says, he is not afraid of bad news. His heart is firm, trusting in the Lord concerning the righteous. Psalm 112, verse 7. Amen to that. We have this word of gratitude from Aileen. Good evening, Simon Regan. I really want to thank you both for all the important information I'm getting from your programs. And God bless you for all the hard work, research that goes into these programs. This helps me to have a better Christian perspective on world events. It's a blessing to have that encouragement, Aileen. Satinder, always helpful perspective. As military equipment pours into Ukraine from NATO, it is making it harder and harder for Putin to invade. NATO want to display a united front, but in reality it is fractured left, right and center. And Putin knows it. Hungary has already said it will not host NATO troops, and Croatia has said it will pull its troops out in the event of any war. Germany is reluctant to send troops due to its gas pipeline project with Russia. Well, at least they sent 5,000 helmets.
Exactly, they make a big difference, don't they?
Come on,
yeah.
Cut them some slack.
Have you seen these? Have you seen these German helmets? They're lethal. Absolutely lethal.
Yeah. Russia, well, the UK and France are still embroiled in a battle over fishing rights. Even blundering Biden pulled back a couple of U.S. warships heading to the Black Sea last year to avoid fueling tensions. Also, ironically, the quickest route to the Ukrainian capital, Kiev, is via Chernobyl. It's interesting. On a lighter note, this may work in the favor of Ukraine, as by the time the Russian troops arrive in Kiev, they probably would have been reduced down to nothing more than a bunch of radioactive mutants. I do like your sense of humor there, Satinder, though I don't think that's going to happen, unfortunately. Irene says, it's awful what's going on in Ukraine. Do you think Putin is doing this because he knows the American president is weak? We were talking about that. I don't think this would have happened if Trump was in power. If Putin succeeds, I'm sure he will try and go for the remaining Soviet Union countries. We really have to pray for Ukraine, and indeed we do, because the thing is, if we say, yes, okay, it's okay, we'll leave Ukraine to sort itself out, well, 1 million troops versus 250,000 troops, nukes versus no nukes, it's not going to happen. And that is, as Anita said, giving a green light to Russia to say, yeah, okay, go on.
But it also has a domino effect.
Yes.
The Chinese then become emboldened, the Iranian regime becomes emboldened against the West, and the West looks even weaker than it does before, which actually then does threaten the entire survival of the Western world. So much is at stake, and thankfully God is sovereign and intervenes in human affairs, and we could be grateful for that. But we have to ask the question, what would a victory look like for President Putin? So victory for him could mean the toppling of Ukraine's West-leaning government and installing a puppet regime. It could be that concessions for NATO, which Western officials have rejected, even banning Ukraine from joining and reducing the number of troops and exercises in Eastern European countries by NATO forces. He could also set on trying to recreate the Soviet Union to reverse what he sees as decades of Russian humiliation since the end of the Cold War. But the major development is Belarus, and I just quickly want to go over this. So according to 77 members of the European Parliament, they say that Russia is in de facto occupying neighboring Belarus. And they say the recent deployment of Russian troops in Belarus poses a threat to the Ukraine, Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, and the whole of Europe. They said also might be part of the ultimate plan to subjugate and occupy Belarus. MPs have said in an open letter to other European institutions yesterday, which was the 1st of February. They said the continued presence of Russian military forces at the request of illegitimate Belarusian President Alexander Zazanenko regime should be treated as an occupation of Belarus. This must be made absolutely clear during the ongoing US and EU talks with Russia, they add. They say that Russia has begun massing 300,000 troops in Belarus for a joint military drill in February, which is called the Allied Resolve 2022, which has already begun. And they say these are highly capable, combat-ready troops, and there are no transparency on these developments, according to the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said last Friday.
What seems to be clear from some of that, Simon, is that Russia already has essentially de facto control of Belarus, and that Lukashenko is a puppet of Putin. So, this is, it's troubling. We're thankful for that scriptural reminder that we had a bit ago to not fear these calamities. We have this from Alan, great show. Is this not inevitable, given end-time prophecy indicates the armies of the north will come against Israel? They would have to go, most likely, through Ukraine, and yes.
Port of Odessa.
Yeah, and so I, personally, Alan, I think that the likelihood is there. I think whether it's now or whether it's in the future, we have to look at what it says.
Well, according to Bible prophecy, I think the key indication with Bible prophecy, this is where I'm coming from, is that you have to literally believe it and take it as literally as you can. And when you look at the motivation in Ezekiel 38 and 39, and it talks about a Russian confederation together with kind of Islamic states who invade Israel, the intention behind those scriptures is not to destroy Israel, which you find very surprising because, of course, that's what the Turks want to do, that's what the Iranians want to do, that's what Hezbollah and Hamas want to do, including the Qataris as well. But it talks about them having a claw going to Israel. Now, we know that Israel is developing natural gas and is selling them currently to Cyprus, to Jordan and Egypt. Now, if that natural gas were to come online, or Israel finds more natural gas plants off the coast of Israel and the Mediterranean, Israel could then sell that natural gas to Europe and cut Russia out, which would then be the biggest motivation for Russia to actually invade Israel.
One of the things that I always find helpful, Simon, is to get a perspective from someone actually on the ground in Ukraine. Earlier in the day, I had the privilege to speak with Pastor Caleb Suko, who is a missionary and pastor in Ukraine and the director of a discipleship initiative and organization that's there. And he gives us a very helpful perspective of what's happening from his own town where he serves, Odessa. Well, I'm joined by Caleb Suko, who, as I understand it, is a pastor in Odessa, Ukraine. Caleb, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much, Regan. Glad to be here.
Tell me a little bit about yourself, your ministry, and where you are in Ukraine, and how ongoing tensions between Russia and Ukraine are affecting you.
We have been in Ukraine since 2007, so we've been here well before these recent tensions and before even the war that started in 2014. 7 years before that, we came here, and our ministry is primarily with Baptist churches here in Ukraine, working to teach on evangelism and discipleship. So we do seminars and conferences throughout Ukraine. Also, we have a church plant that we recently planted just about a year and a half ago here in Odessa. It's an international church plant, so working with internationals. So we've been here for a while, and I would say one of the things that people always asked even before 2014 was, do you think Russia would ever attack? And quite frankly, my answer was always, before 2014, was always, oh no, they would never attack. They're brother nations. And unfortunately, I was proved wrong in 2014 when Crimea was taken, and then the eastern Ukraine Donbass region was then taken by Russian-backed separatists.
So in 2014, Russia invaded, essentially. There was next to nothing done by Western powers governments. There were some threats, I think, maybe a few sanctions threatened Russia's way. But what exactly was your sense of things at the time in 2014? And from that, have tensions eased? Has this only continued? Are we essentially dealing with a situation now that is carrying over from 2014, several years ago now?
Right. So definitely what happened in 2014, there were a number of things that led up to that. But you have to understand that Ukraine, coming out of communism in the early 90s and coming out of the whole Soviet bloc of countries where they were very much part of the Soviet Union and now they're independent. But the problem was that really Ukraine didn't have a lot of its own independence and until the early 2000s when they kind of started pulling away from that strong connection politically and economically with Russia. And so that's kind of what led up to those tensions, which eventually led to the Euromaidan revolution, which actually started in fall of 2013, mainly in Kiev with mass protests, hundreds of thousands of people, and then led to the ousting of the president at that time, Yanukovych, in early 2014, which he fled to Russia and left Ukraine kind of in shambles as far as the government goes, as far as the military goes. And that's when Russia just quickly, well, I wouldn't even say came in to Crimea because they already had something like 30,000 Russians in Crimea because they had an agreement with Ukraine to have a military port, naval port in Crimea. But they did send in more troops and they just took Crimea without any war. And then things started going in eastern Ukraine in, what was that, March, April of 2014, where the war started, unfortunately. So what we see today certainly is a continuation of that because those tensions never, were never completely stopped. There was never a resolution to it. And I think what a lot of people don't realize is that still on the front lines of the war in eastern Ukraine, near Donetsk, Lugansk, there is fighting every day. There's been fighting every day for the past 8 years, since 2014. And we still have soldiers that are being killed. I think just last week, I don't keep up on all the news, but regularly, about once a week, we have a soldier that's killed there. They're just fighting across the front lines. They have trenches that are dug, and that's just kind of at a stalemate, but that is continuing, lingering on to this day.
Why do you think Western powers have only now really begun to take an interest in this conflict?
I have a little bit of a hard time answering for the Western powers because I don't know exactly what their interests are. I can only see, what happens, practically speaking, or in the news here. And obviously in 2014, there was very little that was done by Western powers in way of helping Ukraine. But we have seen that NATO has come in the sense of they haven't sent troops, but that they are involved very actively involved, I would say, in training Ukrainian military. And so training them in anti-tank, aircraft, and of course, the US, Britain, and I think, maybe it's the US and Britain, I think, have actually sent some supplies and some weapons. In 2014, I believe the US did not even send any weapons at that time. It wasn't until Trump got in office that actually US began to actually send some things that were more deadly in that sense. So now, why are they looking at this more carefully? Probably because the buildup of troops, mainly in Belarus, which is something that we did not have in 2014 and is only a recent development within the past couple of months.
And right now, what exactly is the situation? Do you believe there is a legitimate threat of escalated conflict? Will Russia invade Ukraine? Is that the common perspective by the normal man on the street in Ukraine? And if so, do you have any idea? Do you have any thoughts as to what that might lead to on any global scale?
Certainly, there is a legitimate threat right now, and the threat is higher than it has been over the last 7 years or so. That being said, I think what a lot of people don't realize is we've been living with that threat for the past 7-8 years. And so to us, it's not like it's anything completely new. What is new is that there are more troops in Belarus than there have been in the, well, I don't know how many there have been altogether in the past, but that's probably the new development. As far as the regular Ukrainian, the man on the street here, certainly there is concern about this. And some people do feel that Russia might invade. I think I saw a recent poll here in Odessa that said something around 30% of people thought that Russia might actually make a move to invade. But if you compare it to 2014 and 15, the anxiety level of the Ukrainian people is much lower now than it was in 2014. In 2014, your typical Ukrainian was very worried, especially here in Odessa. Many Ukrainians that I talked to talked about going to Western Ukraine or trying to flee somewhere. They were worried that Russia would come to Odessa. So a lot of the panic that we see amongst the expat community is a little bit unusual in the sense that nothing on the ground has actually changed here in Ukraine. It's the same as it was last year, and it's the same as it was 2 years ago. There's absolutely nothing that has changed on the ground. If you were here, you wouldn't notice any difference in daily life than a year or 2 years ago.
So with that in mind, do you think that, as Putin in Russia recently in the past couple of days said, the US is trying to draw Russia into a conflict? Do you believe that Western political parties are in some way, for whatever reason, escalating the situation unhelpfully?
Absolutely not. And I don't see any benefit for the US or UK to start a war in Ukraine. If a war now starts now, it's going to be far bloodier than the war that started in 2014, where we've already lost 14,000 people. It's going to be far bloodier because Ukraine's army is far more prepared and far more ready to fight. And so it would be disastrous for Ukraine. It would be very bad for Russia, and it would be bad for Europe as well. I don't see any reason for them to do that. I really don't. I can't read their minds, but I don't see any reason that they would do that.
That's very helpful. Now, tell us how Christians should be praying for Ukraine, for not only Ukrainian believers, but for the ongoing conflict. We want to be able to pray intelligently into this situation. And what exactly do you anticipate for yourself and your ministry in the coming days as this tension continues?
Definitely pray for peace in Ukraine, because we know that after what happened in 2014 and 15, it became very difficult for some of the churches, and many Christians had to flee from Eastern Ukraine because of that. So definitely pray for peace. Pray also for missionaries and gospel workers who are here or who have had to leave and are hoping to come back, that they would be able to come back. For us, in actually this month, February, I'm actually planning a trip for Eastern Ukraine, where I will be within a few kilometers from the front lines of the active war right now. We minister with the churches there. We try to help them in any way we can. We're going to be doing a conference on discipleship there. And so we have a network of about 15 churches or so that we actively try to help. And so really appreciate your prayers as we do that, because as tensions rise, of course, things can get more difficult for those churches as well.
That sounds wonderful, and of course we will definitely remember you in prayer. Caleb, thank you for your time. Thank you for your ministry. Thank you for taking some time to share with us a first-hand perspective of what's going on there.
You're welcome. Very glad to join you.
I hope that was helpful for all of our viewers to give a first-hand boots on the ground perspective.
Well, thank you for organising that. And we only organised it yesterday, so you've done a great job on that. And I think it's so important to have voices from the Ukraine that can share their experience into the situation.
Absolutely. We have some more emails. Please, you have a limited amount of time to get a really good email.
10 minutes, 10 minutes.
10 minutes left. Dear Simon and Pastor Regan, whilst I believe in Ukraine's independence, there is also the need to consider the fact that NATO and the West expansion to Russia's borders by luring the former Soviet nations into NATO is unacceptable. Having Ukraine join NATO and possibly installing NATO weapons in Ukraine is not a move for peace. This is similar to what led to the Cuban Missile Crisis. People should learn from history. Both NATO and Russia need to pull back. The only useful move from the US or any other nation, including UK, is to push for de-escalation, and that's from Pastor Chitty. I may actually know you, Pastor Chitty.
But also I think you've got to ask, I mean, just responding from that email there is that Katie and myself and my parents went to Salisbury at the weekend. Of course, that was where the Novichok poisonings took place. So in a sense, by carrying out a chemical weapon attack on one of our cities, that's a declaration of war. So we also have to realise the methods that Putin will go to exterminate his opposition leaders. The way that he's tried to also kill the leader of the Russian opposition as well, and his links to the Iranian regime, his links to China. You've got to stand up to bullies. You've got to take them on. And that's what the West has to do. But of course, the West is extremely fragmented right now.
Kev says something very similar to what you've just said. He says, I believe Putin is testing the reactions to his actions. We need to help Ukraine, or could be big issues down the line. I mean, as if there aren't big issues already that we're facing from him. As you've just detailed the links with Iran. He's close with China as well. Best form of attack is showing Putin that he won't be left to do as he wants. If you let Putin continue, he will walk all over. And indeed, that is what bullies do. Now, we were talking about how there's this suggestion, this possibility that Putin will not be keen to invade at this point in time because of the upcoming Beijing 2022 Winter Olympics. Tell us a little bit.
We could have done a whole program on that, couldn't we? Whether the Winter Olympics in Beijing should actually go ahead because of China's belligerence, and certainly after the COVID-19 episode that we've all been suffering from.
Human rights abuses of the Uyghurs.
A million
Christians and whoever.
A million Uyghurs in concentration camps, the persecutions of Christians, the threatening of Taiwan, and trying to dominate the South China Seas. Yeah, but the theory goes is that the Chinese do not want Putin to actually invade the Ukraine during the Winter Olympics, because that will take all the shine of China and all the world attention and focus on China as they host the Winter Olympics. And that could cause a bit of a diplomatic rift between the two nations.
So Tinder's not convinced. He says, I must say, I do not agree with some reports that Putin is holding back on his invasion plans for Ukraine due to the start of the Winter Olympics in China beginning this Friday, the 4th of February. If I recall correctly, back in 2008, he invaded Georgia during the Beijing Olympics, so it didn't stop him then. Why would it stop him now? Who knows, he may even invade Ukraine on Valentine's Day, 14th of February. From Russia, with love.
We'll have to wait and see on that one. Anyway, I just want to show in the dying moments of the programme Britain's response to the Ukraine crisis. Now, our Foreign Secretary Liz Truss wrote a very strong article in the Daily Telegraph a few days ago, and this is what she says. It says, Moscow's campaign against Ukraine and fellow democracies is undermining the very foundation of European security. And so it's vital that we face down the clear and present threat posed by Russia. She almost sounds kind of prime ministerial in this article. She says the stakes are high. Over 100,000 troops are now amassed on Ukraine's border. Russia has attacked Ukraine before, illegally annexing the Crimea in 2014 and bringing war to the Donbas region, so the danger is real. She says the malign activity goes beyond the borders of the Ukraine. Russia is using its influence to fan the flames of discord in the Western Balkans. Russian forces are continuing to arrive in Belarus for so-called joint exercise close to NATO's borders. In recent days, Russia has intensified the brinkmanship by planning naval exercises off the Irish coast and increasing its naval presence in the Baltic Sea, prompting Sweden to send troops to reinforce one of its islands. And of course, I mentioned at the start of the programme that RAF Typhoon fighters had to intercept 4 Russian bombers. So she's saying that yet Russia is jeopardising this hard-won progress in terms of the rehabilitation of Russia prior to Putin. And the situation is extremely precarious. So, you know, that's Britain's response. And I think that article also has a lot to do with Liz Truss's own personal ambitions to become the next Prime Minister as well. But it's nice to see that a British Cabinet Minister is standing strong. She's sounding so much stronger than Dominic Raab as well. Regan, go on, sorry.
What can we actually provide Ukraine, though? I mean, what can we do that will assist them? We don't have much, let's be honest, in regard to our military resources. What
we could do is then adopt the policy that we had in the Cold War of detainment, of containing Russia, and a policy of deterrent. And that's really essentially carrying out NATO exercise forces with Hungary and with Poland, as well as the Ukraine, as a show of strength and a show of force, and then to build up and help equip, as we're doing now, the Ukrainians, and also then to stand strong and not back down. But I think there are, in the last few minutes, some prophetic reasons why we're seeing Russia rise and become a belligerent state, and how the Lord is allowing this to happen. Firstly, from 2020 to 21, Jewish aliyah to Israel has increased by 15% for nations belonging to the former Soviet Union and 15% from Russia. So we're seeing a huge wave of aliyah in fulfillment of biblical prophecy. The more the tension heats up, the more those Jewish communities then will flee and go to Israel. We also see that, as I mentioned earlier with Ezekiel 38 and 39, it could be the issue of Israel's natural gas that triggers the Ezekiel 38 and 39 invasion. Then we also see how the crisis in the Ukraine is helping to spread the gospel. And I didn't show, but we do have a video clip of CBN. We couldn't show it tonight because we haven't got time. It talks about how one of the big stadiums in the last summer, the 20,000 Christians got together to pray and intercede for the Ukraine. So there's huge amounts of prayer and intercession going into the Ukraine. We also know that the Ukrainian president called for a national day of prayer. And so that is bringing Ukrainians closer to the Lord. And also, I think, finally, what God is showing is how weak the West is without him. Without our Judeo-Christian heritage, without our moral compass, you know, we can't stand up to Russia. We can't stand up to the Chinese because we're not strong enough. And only with God's help are we able to mount the challenges that we're facing. So it's a reminder of the dangers we face because our nations have departed from him.
We've lost all sense of morality. We've lost all sense of objective truth. As a whole, our leaders lack integrity and good character. Yes, they may do some good things and some righteous things here and there, but in regard to their own personal lives and how they handle many of these issues, there's corruption, there's rampant sin and godlessness, and you know, this is fulfillment of the scriptural promise. Righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. We see that in Russia at the moment, there's this active aggression that we can do little about. And so it's reassuring to hear of gospel progress. It is often in these times of suffering that we see testimonies of God's great power all the more.
Absolutely. It was great doing a program with you, Regan. Really enjoyed it tonight. And I want to thank you all for watching at home as we try to unpack the growing crisis and tension that we're seeing in the Ukraine as Putin has amassed over 100,000 troops on Ukraine's border. And it's a reminder to us how fragile our world is, but thankfully God is in control, He's sovereign, so let's keep the people of Ukraine in our prayers, that they would be resolute and turn to Him, but also our nations would turn to Him, because we can't cope with the crisis we're facing. So thank you for watching tonight's Behind the Headlines.